Sony has some of the best studios in the world under its banner, such as Polyphony and Sony Santa Monica, but there is one that stands out as their crown jewel, and that's Naughty Dog. Founded back in 1984 when Andy Gavin and Jason Rubin came together to create Jason and Andy's Magic, or Jam software, even at the young age of 12 they noticed that Andy was very good at making some very advanced code and Jason's art looked very good. Armed with a couple of Apple IIs and without having any help from modern things like the internet, they went about trying to create their first game together. First, they decided to make an unofficial PC port of the Nintendo arcade game Punch-Out! Working on it for about a year and without any of Nintendo's lawyers, the project was completely stopped in its tracks as they accidentally copied a blank floppy onto the version of the game. Even with this setback, their first title was released, Math Jam, in 1985. The two 15-year-olds copied the game onto floppy disks with photocopied instructions all thrown together in plastic bags to distribute. With this being an educational game, there was a lot of politics to get around to sell the game to schools, and so they turned their eyes to doing their passion, actually creating games. A year later, the two brought out Ski Crazed, a simple 2D skiing game where a player has to ski down a slope to avoid obstacles, and to do that they progress onto harder stages or to stages you could create yourself using the in-game editor. For this title, the two approached a small publisher called Boardville, who published the game, which went on to sell 1,500 copies on the Apple II. In 1987, Jam Software released their second and final game in conjunction with Boardville, Dream Zone. In this adventure game, the player had to try and escape the child's dream world, which is full of nightmarish creatures, airships, a floating castle, and a troublesome bureaucracy. This was also the first game to be made available on something not the Apple II, as the game was ported to the Amiga. The game sold well, shipping about 10,000 copies, but Andy and Jason wanted more, and so ditched Boardville to go with EA. For their first game with EA, Andy and Jason decided to make an RPG called Keith the Thief, which was released in 1989. The game released on the Apple II, Amiga, and MS-DOS. This was also the first game to be released under the new name for the studio, Naughty Dog. The development wasn't without its problems, however, with EA wanting to make the game more comedic rather than the serious RPG they wanted to make. This possibly even limited the game to only 50,000 copies sold, which, although a huge number and their biggest game to date, is still well under what they could have achieved. The next game for Naughty Dog started development straight away and saw a huge shift in the company. Up to this point, their games came out on PC, but their newest title, Rings of Power, released on the new Sega Genesis. This is their first foray into consoles, and the company never looked back. Releasing in 1991, Rings of Power was an isometric role-playing game with hundreds of NPCs and a very open-ended gameplay. The game was seen by some as being too difficult, but reviews were mostly good, and the game went on to sell out its original 100,000 copy run. Unfortunately, EA decided not to print anymore, as they preferred to print more sports games which were cheaper and seen as more accessible, most notably Madden. All this would prove to be the end of Naughty Dog's relationship with EA, and after some time off, they got started to work on a new game for a very new system, the 3DO. This new console had a disk drive, so was seen as being revolutionary, and the co-founders liked this as they hated cartridges. The game they eventually made was Way of the Warrior, a fighting game much like Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter. They funded the development themselves but got a publisher on board to not only release the game but also to fund development on their next projects. Way of the Warrior sold well for 3DO standards, but this console was doomed, and thus Naughty Dog moved its attention to another console, the new Sony PlayStation. With a 3-game deal in place with Universal Studios, Andy and Jason finally had the resources and creative freedom to create whatever they wanted. They decided with the new technology coming out that 3D was the way forward and went with PlayStation as the platform to release their vision. The problem was they still didn't know what their vision was and decided there were 3 ways to make a 3D game. You could just rotate the camera so you get 3D but it's still just a 2D platformer, move the camera to go in out of the camera, or go full open world. Incredibly, without having any idea what each other was doing, Sony, Nintendo and Sega all came to the same conclusion and all picked a very different way of doing things, with Mario 64 going open world, Night into Dreams going 2D for Sega, and Naughty Dog going for the in-out style with Crash. History shows that Nintendo and Sony's decision worked, where Sega simply didn't and isn't something much used in games today. With this decision made, Andy and Jason didn't have a full concept for the game, but took a lot of inspiration from Donkey Kong Country, and thus Willy the Wombat was created. The size of the new game and how development was becoming more difficult meant that the first Naughty Dog employees could be hired. With some new help and now being based in LA, the much-loved mascot for Sony was created, and with a timely name change, the world was introduced to Crash Bandicoot. The game itself was very simple, with the camera following Crash whilst he jumped and span just to stay alive, break crates and collect Wumpa Fruit. When Crash came out in 1996, it was the most graphically stunning game ever released at the time. They managed to do this thanks to some technical wizardry and the fact that if something can't be seen on camera, it simply isn't rendered. This allowed everything to be high resolution and for Crash himself to have 582 polygons. The most incredible thing though is that Crash Bandicoot outsold Mario. This might have been helped by the PS1 outselling the N64 3-1, but still an incredible achievement, and suddenly Naughty Dog was a big player. With Sony now having a mascot to go against Sega and Nintendo, Naughty Dog decided to do another first and create its first ever sequel. By the time the sequel started though, there really didn't seem any need for Universal. Sony knew they had their mascot that they weren't even looking for, and a possible franchise to push their new system to new heights. Universal at this point were just getting money from Sony, holding on to it for 90 days, and then giving it to Naughty Dog to spend. This was really the start of the end of this relationship and the eventual acquisition by Sony. Only 1 year after the release of the huge success of Crash Bandicoot, Crash 2 Cortex Strikes Back released. The game was really just more of the first, with new levels and a few more animations to go with it. Once again though, the game was a hit and Sony truly had its first major franchise. With all this, Crash Bandicoot became a trilogy as Crash Bandicoot Warped was released in 1998. This would also prove to be the last game made with Universal, as the 3-game deal finally came to an end. A lot of this was made possible thanks to Mark Cerny, who's most known for being the lead architect on the PS4, but at the time was working for Universal and was the link between them, Sony and Naughty Dog. Cerny worked much more closely on this title, but everyone at the studio knew their time with the Bandicoot was coming to an end. Once Crash Team Racing was released, it was seen as being possibly the best kart racer available, and some even pitting it above Mario Kart. But Naughty Dog were done with Universal, and Cerny convinced them to end their relationship with the publisher.
What in green tarnation do you two want?
I was...
Don't tell me! Instead of heeding my wisdom, the two of you went mucking around in the only place that I told you not to go, Misty Island.
That's right, and then...
And, Daxter, you finally took a much-needed bath, but in a bathtub filled with dark eco.
Look, old man, are you gonna keep yapping, or are you gonna help me out of this mess?
With the 90s coming to a close, word of a new console generation started as Sony would release the PlayStation 2. With this, Naughty Dog wanted to create a new IP, which would eventually become Jak and Daxter. But there was one major problem to get out of the way first. Sony felt burnt with Crash. After pumping so much money into their #1 franchise and making him their mascot in the 90s, by 2002, there was suddenly a Crash game on competing devices. They trusted Naughty Dog to make good games and so would happily give them money to do so, but they didn't want another situation like with Crash again, and so after some meetings and reportedly a lot of alcohol, Sony acquired Naughty Dog, and so the match made in heaven was complete. The fact is that unlike with Boardville, EA and even Universal to an extent, Sony have allowed Naughty Dog to do as they wish and trust them to do so, meaning they run themselves as an indie studio but are in fact Sony's main first party house. The first game after becoming part of Sony was Jak and Daxter, designed to be like Crash but even more accessible and much larger in scale. During the development, Josh Scher was hired. He would go on to play a major role in later games, but for now it showed that Naughty Dog's studio was growing. With the help of new people at the studio and Sony, Jak and Daxter, the precursor Legacy, was released in 2001 for the PlayStation 2 and was a smash hit. Towards the end of development, the gaming landscape started to change dramatically. Games like God of War and Killzone started to come along and games were growing up. The big one, however, was Grand Theft Auto 3, which changed games forever and would even be seen as competitor to Jak and Daxter as it was open world. All this meant that with Jak 2, the studio wanted to have even more of a focus on cutscenes and story. You see, games at the time that had cutscenes had characters talking directly at the camera, which was a very video game thing to do. The likes of Scher wanted to make more cinematic cutscenes with movie-like cuts to give more of a story and make the game feel more like a piece of mainstream media and not just a video game.
Wrong side could be unhealthy. We want to see the shadow. Not likely. If you want to join something, why don't you and your pet go join the circus? Unless you've got the fur for a really tough task. Steal the Baron's banner from the top of the ruined tower and bring it back to me. Then maybe we'll talk.
This was also the first time the studio spent more money on sound design and music to get across atmosphere and story even more. Jak 2 released in 2004 and was once again a huge success, except in Japan, where the game bombed. This was expected, however, as the game was much darker and so alienated the market quite a bit.
This place has too much excitement. We need to move back to the country.
Just a year later, Jak 3 released and was simply an evolution of the Jak and Daxter formula, but this time, instead of it being GTA 3 being the influence, it was Smuggler's Run, another Rockstar game showing Naughty Dog were looking at the rest of the industry when creating their games. Once again, Jak 3 was a huge success and Naughty Dog had another hit on its hands.
Daxter!
Don't thank me. I'm only here because you wouldn't last a second without me. Okay, tough guy. You got us into this mess. Now you gotta get us out.
What a team we'll make! Let's just get moving. But which way? That way!
That way.
Oh, and I suppose you know where you're going, huh?
Better than you do, bent beak.
Let's just move.
History once again repeated as they released Jak X combat rating to more great reviews and success, but at this point things were starting to change drastically for the company. The game came out in 2005 and would be the last game Naughty Dog developed for the PS2. This was seen as a transition game in the company as Andy and Jason were looking to leave. Step up, Evan Wells and Christoph Balestra. Over a 2-year period, these two were slowly but surely given the reins and the two co-founders left. This transition was very carefully planned, but nothing could have prepared anyone for the turbulent times ahead, with the company moving on to the PlayStation 3 and Project Big.
Sully? We got some trouble. Hurry it up.
Okay, what's going on?
Pirates?
Pirates?
Yeah, the modern kind. They don't take prisoners. At least not male prisoners.
Wait, what are you talking about? Shouldn't we call the authorities or something?
Yeah, that'd be a great idea, but we don't exactly have a permit to be here.
What?
Yeah, so unless you want to end up in a Panamanian jail, we should probably handle this ourselves.
Well, what's worse?
You obviously haven't been in a Panamanian jail. Do you know how to use one of these?
Yeah, it's like a camera. You point and shoot, right?
Good girl. Here we go.
During the transition to the PS3, Sony and Naughty Dog decided to split the studio in two for the first time. They created the ICE division to help create a game engine for all the first parties, which is still at Naughty Dog to this day. The only thing is they didn't actually create an engine, but instead helped the other studios with their own engines to help make games better as a whole. However, with all this, the studio tried to make two games, one for the PSP, which never saw the light of day, and Project Big on the PS3. The company nearly fell apart during the transition between consoles because of everything hitting at the same time to create a sort of perfect storm. A lot of people left the studio at this time and it genuinely came close to being the end of the studio. Thing is though, when you have that much talent under one roof, things get done, and that's exactly what happened. The PSP game later became Jak and Daxter The Lost Frontier, which eventually finished by High Impact Games. This didn't happen because Naughty Dog weren't creating something good, but because at the time they couldn't make two games at once. With the studio split in two, talent was being wasted on the PSP title, which would be much better served on Project Big. One of these people was Neil Druckmann, the man who would later go on to direct The Last of Us, and even go on to be the president of the company. At the time, the architecture of the PS3, having a cell processor amongst other problems, meant that getting anything to run on the hardware was incredibly difficult. Things moved along incredibly slowly, but all of a sudden you had a whole team working on it, and that's when things started to turn around. There was two things in particular that helped, however. One was Sony themselves, who allowed Naughty Dog to do as they wanted because they trusted them. The other was Amy Hennig, who also would later go on to write and direct Uncharted 1, 2 and 3. In Hennig they had someone with the vision and determination to create something special, and to create the idea for Uncharted she watched countless movies and read through countless books, all to create her vision for Nathan Drake, Sully and co. The sheer amount of work she and the rest of the team put in to make Project Big a reality was immense, and in the end of it, it paid off. even after all the problems of even getting the engine to work on the PS3 and the game changing constantly. When the game was finally shown off at E3 2006, the studio had settled on a name, but Sony showed it without one. It wasn't even until E3 2007 that the game was actually playable, and it would come out less than 6 months from then. However, towards the end of 2007, Uncharted Drake's Fortune released, and the PlayStation fans eventually flocked to it.
Wait, Sully, do you hear that? Now there's something you don't see every day. My God.
Sony didn't give the game too much of a marketing campaign, probably because they were worried about how the public would perceive it, but word of mouth helped propel Uncharted into being a classic. It was a complete no-brainer at this point that a sequel would be made, and the studio set out to correct all the mistakes made with the first.
But that's it. An oil lamp. Yeah. It's worthless. I don't get it.
Neither do we. That's why we tracked you down.
With Uncharted 1, everything had to be scaled back a lot due to the new hardware, new engine, and going for much more realistic setting with humans rather than cartoony characters. For the sequel, Naughty Dog decided to use performance capture rather than just motion capture. This meant that all the dialogue actors gave during their performances would now be used in the game rather than getting the dialogue in a recording booth afterwards. This not only allowed them to get across more emotion and help ground the characters even more, but also get across the action much better as well. Uncharted 2 began development straight away with the simple idea that it would be awesome to fight on a moving train. This now famous train sequence was the first level to start development and the last to be finished. This game would also see Drake move out of just being in a jungle and a castle into a more wide open world, with the likes of the Himalayas being the backdrop for a huge portion of the story in Uncharted 2. The game became exactly what the studio wanted the first to be, but didn't have the time to create. They rewrote everything from the lighting engine to the AI. This was a completely different game and was also one that finally launched the studio to being Sony's best. Uncharted 2 Among Thieves launched in 2009 and was the smash hit of the year, winning countless Game of the Year awards and selling incredibly well too. Naughty Dog had finally announced itself. Problem is, when you have a success like this, how do you replicate it or even surpass it? Well, Naughty Dog had to try and do so and started work on the third Uncharted. This time Drake would be searching for the Atlantis of the desert and would see the set pieces grow even more to see Nate jump out of a plane whilst fighting bad guys. Once again though, the development wasn't as smooth as it could have been, as Naughty Dog did its famous split. Unknown to the public at the time, only about half of the studio worked on Uncharted 3 as the others worked on something completely different that would go on to change the industry. Uncharted 3 Drake's Deception released in 2011 and was once again a smash hit, winning a lot of Game of the Year awards, but some saw this game as being slightly inferior to the second. The melee combat was overhauled and the story jumped around in time a lot, with us even getting to see our first glimpse as Drake as a kid. The studio started to show another shift in this game, with it being more heavily focused on the characters and story and less on just the mindless action of the last two games, and this would show even more in what was to come.
I shot the hell out of that guy, huh?
Yeah, you sure did.
I feel sick.
And you just hang back like I told you to.
Well, you're glad I didn't, right?
I'm glad I didn't get my head blown off by a goddamn kid.
You know what? No. How about, hey, Ellie, I know it wasn't easy, but it was either him or me. Thanks for saving my ass. You got anything like that for me, Joel?
We gotta get going.
Lead the way.
Once Uncharted 3 was out, the whole team moved on to work on the new IP with the other half of the studio. This game was being headed by Neil Druckmann and Bruce Straley, and it wasn't without its problems, and it was something that would need the whole studio to realise. Both Neil Druckmann and Bruce Straley went to the co-presidents and said they wanted to make a new game set in a post-apocalyptic world, and that they really wanted to create a story around two characters. The story itself went through many iterations before the final version was decided upon. The concept for the infection that would destroy society came from the BBC documentary Planet Earth, when it showed the contracepts fungus take over ant colonies. This fungus breaks through the skin of the ant and sends it into a rage, and so the studio thought, well, what would happen if this moved into humans? This led to clickers, and so all forms of infected in the game were based off of them. You see, the guys at Naughty Dog saw the beauty of this fungus and saw it as a contrast to the tone of the world and atmosphere. This wasn't the only place they tried to show beauty, however, with the overgrowth in the urban areas being shown throughout the game, showing the nature was taking back the world.
You see this? Don't scare it.
I won't.
What are you doing?
It's all right. Come here. Hey, fella. Hurry up. Go on.
The game was also made to be much more like a movie than games are normally, with the actors even using improv during their scenes to bring across their version of the story. In terms of gameplay, a lot was taken from Uncharted, with the camera being third person and the shooting feeling similar as well. However, everything was even more weighty, with even the hand-to-hand combat feeling more weighty and brutal. This time, Naughty Dog paid more attention to sound design and music in the game, and so reached out to Gustavo Santaolalla, a well-established composer who won an Oscar for both Brokeback Mountain and Babel. This helps show that games don't just need to be mindless platforming or shooting, but can show real emotion and people can relate with these characters on a grounded level. The Last of Us released in 2013 to incredible critical and commercial success, and was seen as many to be a game which would change the industry. Suddenly, games could tell really compelling stories and make you feel for the characters and still be incredibly fun and beautiful. Just like Zelda, Ocarina of Time and the Half-Life games, we're now in a different era of storytelling in the industry, and Naughty Dog was cemented as one of the top studios in the world.
Tommy knows this area
Fuck
better than... Well, I'm sorry. I trust him better than I trust myself.
Stop with the bullshit. What are you so afraid of? That I'm gonna end up like Sam? I can't get infected. I can take care of myself.
How many close calls have we had?
Well, we seem to be doing all right so far.
And now you'll be doing even better with Tommy.
I'm not her, you know.
What?
Maria told me about Sarah.
Ellie?
And
You are treading on some mighty thin ice here.
I'm sorry about your daughter, Joel. But I have lost people too.
You have no idea what loss is.
Everyone I have cared for has either died or left me. Everyone fucking except for you. So don't tell me that I would be safer with someone else, because the truth is I would just be more scared.
You're right. You're not my daughter. And I sure as hell ain't your dad.
Normally, after a game like this releases, the whole team would go on holiday, but this time was very different. For the first time, Naughty Dog decided to create a standalone DLC based around Ellie. The DLC looks to bridge the gap between Joel being impaled on a metal spike and Ellie being captured by the cannibals, all whilst giving the players more of an insight into Ellie's past before she met Joel. The game wasn't without its controversy, by the way, with many praising and some complaining about one scene in particular. During a scene in the mall, Ellie kisses her companion Riley, showing she is in fact gay. Unfortunately, some people didn't like this as she is only 14, but Naughty Dog wanted to push her character's sexuality in that direction, and so the scene was kept. Left Behind released in early 2014 to some good success, with many loving the ability to get back into the world and discover more about Ellie. Just a few months after The Last of Us came out, Sony released the PS4, and once again Naughty Dog had another transition to go through. This time, however, they were much more prepared and decided to port The Last of Us to the new system. Doing this allowed the team to learn how to get their engine working on a new system, which is much closer to a PC, and also meant there wasn't the problems that plagued the company during the last console release. Everything was up-res and showed the power of the new system. The frame rate was upped to 60 frames per second, and the controls were changed so that shooting used the bottom triggers rather than the top. The Last of Us Remastered released in 2014 and once again got amazing reviews. This allowed players who didn't own a PS3 to play the game, as the PS4 was trouncing the Xbox One at the time, with many people jumping into Sony for the first time. The remaster was of course made to help prepare the studio for their next big title, and it was one that would close a story many held close to their hearts. The game would of course become the final Uncharted game, but during the development Naughty Dog was once again shook hard. It was announced that Amy Hennig had left the studio, and some people even reported that she was pushed out by Neil Druckmann and Bruce Straley. Evan Wells and Christoph Balestra quickly released a statement defending their two employees and saying they had no input in Hennig leaving. This, however, left a huge hole to fill, as the writer and creative director of the Uncharted series had left, and so Druckmann and Straley stepped in. This meant the game focused much more on the story of Drake, Elena and Sully. It also introduced Sam, Drake's brother. This added a whole new layer to the story and opened up a way to truly end Nathan Drake's story.
Oh, yeah. Okay. You all right? Yeah. How do I look? Like 400 million bucks. Let's go. All right, I'm right behind you.
During development, Naughty Dog also utilised facial capture as well as motion capture. This meant that even facial expressions of the actors were captured to allow the animators to immerse players even more. This extra immersion also allowed developers to create a much darker experience and ground the story much more in reality. In the end, the game felt like a mix of Uncharted and The Last of Us, and showed how the studio was growing. Of course, the huge set pieces the studio is known for were still present, but this time didn't feel as outlandish, but more organic to the journey. This, alongside more great acting from Nolan North, Troy Baker, Richard McGonigal, Emily Rose and co, meant that Naughty Dog closed the series in an almost perfect way, whilst also leaving it open for another Sony developer to come in and carry it on in the future.
Sully?
Know what I love about partying with a bunch of crooks?
What's that?
Nobody cares if you're smoking indoors.
It's been a while.
Too long, boyo.
Uncharted 4: A Thief's End released in 2016 and was seen by most as being the PS4's best game to date, and thus was a huge commercial success as well as a critical hit. Of course, many wondered what the studio would do next, and at PSX 2016 they stunned everyone with a surprise announcement that we all knew was coming. During the showcase, the studio announced two new titles. One was coming out in the next year, and the other was described as very early in development. First of all was Uncharted Lost Legacy, a standalone DLC to Uncharted 4, where the player would control Chloe Fraser instead of Drake. This was the first Uncharted title not to include Drake, but it did manage to close Chloe's story, as she didn't appear in Uncharted 4 at all. Uncharted Lost Legacy got mostly good reviews when it came out in 2017, and it even sold quite well, but most said it just felt like a continuation of Uncharted 4 and didn't really add anything new at all.
Their greatest treasure, the Tusk of Ganesh. Now that's not an easy find.
What are you doing?
3 Persian invasions, 3 separate wars, and all these years later, no one has found it.
We're close.
You're lost, and the only chance you have of even narrowing down its location is to find someone who can help you crack this artifact.
Something big happened at the studio during development, however, as Christoph Balestra, one of the co-presidents, announced he was leaving the studio to focus more on his family and personal projects. This meant that Evan Wells would have become the sole president of the studio, which would have been a first in its history, but he decided to promote someone else instead. Neil Druckmann had long been praised for his contributions on The Last of Us and Uncharted 4, and was starting to make much bigger studio-wide decisions, and so was promoted to co-president. He would, however, still be working on creative director on the other title announced at PSX, The Last of Us Part 2.
What are you doing, kiddo? You really gonna go through with this?
I'm gonna find... and I'm gonna kill every last one of them.
So far we've only seen a couple of cinematic trailers and one gameplay trailer, but the game is gearing up to be something special and is seen by many as the most anticipated game in development right now. The game looks set for a 2020 release, although recent rumours have pointed at a possible 2019 window. But with a team like Naughty Dog working on it, the expectation is for the game to be incredible, but only time will tell if they can live up to or even surpass these. Over the course of their history, Naughty Dog has constantly pushed the boundaries of what a game can be, whether it's the first 3D platformer with Crash or storytelling in The Last of Us. Naughty Dog has cemented itself as one of the world's top studios, and even the crown jewel of Sony's first party.